Okay, so today's video is going to involve a little bit of chemistry review, well hopefully review, talk a little bit about properties of water, and then kind of relate all that back to plants. How water is able to move from the roots of a plant hundreds of feet up to the top of the tree. So let's start with a little bit of our chemistry, and so hopefully this will be reviewed, some of it may not, so we'll just kind of treat it all like it's a little bit brand new. So one of the things that we're going to focus on chemistry-wise here is how atoms are able to join together. Okay, and if y'all remember, atoms have what are called valence electrons. And hopefully you'll remember that valence electrons are the ones in the outermost shell. From now on out, you will probably see me write electron that way. So remember, if I have my typical atom, right, I have my nucleus of my atom, which has my protons and my neutrons, and then I have those orbits that the electrons are orbiting around the nucleus. And so for our purposes, the first shell there, okay, so our first shell only holds 2 electrons. The second shell can hold up to 8 electrons. 1, 2, 3. And the third shell can hold up to 8 as well, and that's as far as we're going to go, because for our purposes, biology-wise, that would be all we need. And remember, the outermost shell, that is our valence shell. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so the outermost shell are the valence shell. So in this instance, the valence electrons are these here. Okay, it may be a smaller atom, and so the valence electrons, for instance, a hydrogen atom that has, so here's my hydrogen atom, proton, neutron, just has one little electron. So that's my valence electron for my hydrogen atom. So it's just whatever is my outermost ring. Those are my valence electrons. And those are the ones that can be shared, they can be exchanged between molecules. Those are the ones that form bonds. Okay, so these are the electrons that are able to form bonds between atoms. So let's talk a little bit about the different kinds of bonds that they could form. So the first kind that we have is what's called an ionic bond. Okay, and so an ionic bond is formed between 2 atoms. And so what happens with an ionic bond is when there's just 1 or 2 electrons, it needs 1 or 2 more electrons to be happy, or if it lost 1 or 2 electrons, it would be happy. Its valence shell would be full. Let's look at an example here. Okay, so let's say we had sodium. And again, this isn't full-on chemistry class, this is just biology, so I don't care about protons, neutrons, whatever. We've got sodium, that's what I'm labeling us there. Okay, and our other one is going to be chlorine over here. Okay, and so I've got some electrons. Okay, so I've got a sodium and a chlorine atom here. And you'll notice the sodium has 1 electron in its valence shell. Well, and it's the third shell here, so it really wants 8. So this needs 7 more to be happy. It's kind of a lot. Okay, if you look at the chlorine over here, the chlorine is missing 1. It only needs 1 more to be happy. It has 7 in its valence shell. So what will happen with an ionic bond is formed, okay, is that the molecules, the atoms here, one will give up an electron and the other one will accept it. It's a give and take situation. Okay, so in this instance, if the sodium releases this electron here, now its valence shell, which is right here, is full, and it's happy little camper. But it's missing an electron, so it becomes an ion, and it has a positive charge, because now it has more protons than it does electrons. Well, if chlorine will happily pick that electron up, and so now its valence shell is happy, but it has an extra electron, so it has a big fat negative charge. Well, hopefully most of you guys remember positive and negative are attracted to one another, and so this will form a bond between these 2 atoms, and you get a sodium molecule. Okay, so we get our bond here between these 2, and this is an ionic bond. Okay, there are ions that will bond together, and an ion is just a molecule with a charge. Okay, so an ion just for those of you so you remember, is a molecule with a charge. And so when that sodium gives up that electron, it gets a charge. When that chlorine gains that electron, it gets a charge. And so again, those positive and negative charges are attracted to one another. These bonds are within the molecule. So this becomes salt right here. So when these guys bond together here, that's salt. That's a molecule. They're held together by an ionic bond. So the other kind of bond that can hold atoms together is what's called a covalent bond. And so in a covalent bond, the electrons are shared as opposed to one atom taking one from another. The electrons are shared between the atoms. So this is a stronger bond than an ionic bond. Okay, so these hold the molecules together a little bit tougher than an ionic bond. And so when they share the electrons will spend time around both atoms. For instance, let's say I had, let me pick an easy one here. Let's pick carbon. Okay, so let's say I had a carbon here. And we're not going to keep drawing all of your molecules here. I'm just going to worry about the valence shell here. So carbon has 4 electrons in its valence shell, right? So it needs 4 more to be happy. That's a lot of electrons to try to take from an atom, but it's also a lot of electrons to give up. So carbon will end up sharing electrons. For instance, let's give it some hydrogens that it can hang out with. Okay, well, hydrogens have 1 electron in their valence shell. So if this hydrogen shares its electron with this carbon, so now they share these electrons here. Okay, the hydrogen's happy. It's got 2 that orbit it sometimes. Now the carbon has 5 that sometimes orbit it. Well, if I put 4 of these hydrogens on here, and I make a methane molecule here, those are supposed to be 2 dots because that's how you represent the bonds with dots. Okay, and I put my last little hydrogen up here. Okay. Now this carbon has 8 electrons that will float around it on occasion, and all the hydrogens have 2 that will go around them. So they share those electrons, and now everybody's happy. And like I said, this is a stronger bond than an ionic bond. So let's look at what happens when those electrons, though, are not shared equally. So you can have the formation of what's called a polar covalent bond. So this is still a covalent bond. So they're still sharing the electrons because it's still a type of covalent bond. But in this case, it's an unequal sharing. And this is really important with water in your biological systems. So water forms these polar covalent bonds. Right? Most of y'all were comfortable with the fact that water is H2O. So if we look at this, oxygen, okay, so I've got my oxygen molecule, okay, and I've got my hydrogen molecules out here, right? And let's actually draw this to scale a little bit better. I think that will make a difference, although, yeah, now I just messed that up. Okay, so oxygen, remember hydrogen has 1 electron to share, right? So oxygen has 6 electrons. So when it shares an electron with 2 hydrogens, it fills up with 8. The hydrogens get 2. The deal here though, is that oxygen is a really big molecule, okay? Especially compared to hydrogen. Really big molecule, and it's kind of an electron hog. And so the electrons end up spending more time around the oxygen than they do around the hydrogen. And so because the electrons are spending more time around the oxygen, it actually makes the oxygen have a little bit of a negative charge. Not a full-blown negative charge, but just a little bit. That's what that little symbol there is. It needs just a little bit. It's a delta symbol. Well, if the electrons are spending way more time around the oxygen than they do around the hydrogen, that makes the hydrogen then have a little bit of positive charge. So I still have a covalent bond. Okay, this is my polar covalent bond right there. It's inside of the molecule. It's holding the molecule together. Okay, that's my polar covalent bond. My other one is over here. Polar covalent bond, holding that molecule together within the molecule. But because I have these partial charges here, this water molecule can now bond to other water molecules. And that's what we're going to look at next. Okay, so the last type of bond that we're going to talk about is what's called a hydrogen bond. And so a hydrogen bond is not found inside of the molecule. Each one of these individual guys is a water molecule. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 water molecules in this picture here. Hydrogen bonds are between molecules. Okay, so they're not holding atoms together, they're holding molecules together. And these are what are considered weak bonds. Okay, so they are weak bonds between molecules. You know, water is attracted to one another as water molecules are attracted to one another, as all of y'all have seen at some point in time, but they are not so stuck together they cannot be broken apart. So these are weak bonds between molecules, and they're due to these polar covalent bonds. So as we look at this picture here, okay, these solid bonds right here, these are my polar covalent bonds, right? There's my polar covalent bond there. Okay, and it's, remember, my polar covalent bond is that unequal sharing of these electrons. So this oxygen gets a slightly negative charge, those hydrogens have slightly positive charge. Well, just like an ionic bond, remember, positive and negative are attracted to one another. So if I have multiple water molecules in the same place, the negative portion of one water molecule is going to be attracted to the positive portion of the other water molecule. And that's what forms that hydrogen bond. Okay, is these bonds between the molecules. So there's another hydrogen bond, there's one. So again, I've got my slightly positive hydrogen attracted to my negative oxygen. And so those will hold things together. Think about surface tension. When you have most of you guys have seen this at some point in time, right? You have a glass of water and you fill it just a little bit too high and it makes that bubble and it doesn't spill over yet. Okay, that's because of those hydrogen bonds. The water molecules are attracted to one another. And then when the force becomes too great and it breaks those bonds, then it spills over the sides. Okay, but hydrogen bonds are what hold those water molecules together. And we're talking about this because this is really important for plants. This is how water is going to be able to get from the roots of a plant 200 feet up to the top of a giant sequoia tree. Let's talk about our properties of water. We've got 4 different properties of water that we're going to be discussing. So the first one is going to be that essentially the ice floats. That ice is less dense than water. Okay, so as water freezes, and you know that frozen water is ice, right? So as water freezes, it expands. And so that makes more air be trapped in those frozen molecules. So ice is actually less dense than water and it floats. And when ice forms on, for instance, when ice forms on a body of water in the wintertime, it forms from the top down. Okay, because ice is less dense than water. So it will form from the top down. And so what happens is that top layer of ice actually acts as an insulator. Okay, and it keeps the rest of it from freezing. And so it only freezes along the top, and so there's water underneath. And so that helps the organisms that live there. If the entire lake froze, then none of those organisms will survive. But this way, with just having the ice on the top, it acts as an insulator, and it allows these organisms to still survive through the winter. It keeps the whole body of water from freezing. Okay. That concept there, that ice floats and can act as an insulator, would lead us into our next property. So the second one that we're going to talk about is that water has what's called a high specific heat. And that means that it takes a lot of energy. Okay, so it takes lots of energy to change the temperature of water 1 degree. Okay, water, it takes a lot of energy to heat water for it to get warmer, And then it also requires a lot of energy to be lost for water to cool. Once water has been heated, it retains that heat for a while because it has this high specific heat. Okay? I like to think about it with you with the oven and your eyes. Okay? Your eyes are made of mostly water, right? And so every time you open the oven, you don't feel all this uncomfortable heat in your eyes. They don't just burn up and evaporate. And that's because water has such a high specific heat. Water can absorb lots and lots of energy before it actually evaporates. Think about how long it takes for a giant pot of water to finally boil. So our third property of water that we're going to talk about is what's called a universal solvent. Water is the universal solvent. And you remember solutions are made of solutes and solvents. Solvents are the ones that do the dissolving. Okay, so water is really good at breaking stuff down. Okay, it's really good at dissolving things, especially ionic compounds, things between ionic bonds. Remember, ionic compounds, they have the charge, right? I've got the positive ion and the negative ion, and they're attracted to one another, and that's how they're bonded together. Well, remember, water is polar. It's made of those polar covalent bonds, so it has a charge. Okay, and so because water is polar and it has those charges, it can actually break apart these sodium and chlorine ions. If you look at this picture here, I've got my sodium in the middle there, and all these negative oxygens. Remember, the electrons spend more time around the oxygen, so the oxygen has a little bit of negative charge. And if you'll notice the orientation around the chlorine atom, those hydrogen ions that have that positive charge, they're attracted to the negative of the chlorine. And the attraction of the water molecules, of these ions to the water molecules, is stronger than their attraction to one another. And so water is able to break them apart. So it is considered the universal solvent. The last one is the one that we're going to apply the most to plants, would be the properties of cohesion and adhesion. Okay, and so this is essentially water's ability to stick to or be attracted to other molecules. Okay, cohesion is that it's attracted like to like. Okay, so cohesion is the water is attracted to other water molecules. You see that happening here in the surface tension. See how the bug is not falling through? Because remember, you have those hydrogen bonds, right? I've got my big giant oxygen, okay, with its little bit of negative charge, and it's got its polar covalent bonds to those hydrogens with their little bit of positive charge. Okay, and I got another water molecule nearby. Well, its big giant slightly negative oxygen is going to be attracted to the slightly positive hydrogen. Remember, so they're forming these hydrogen bonds. There's my hydrogen bond right there. And so this bug is not heavy enough to break that bond. So that's our surface tension. That's why that bug's able to walk on water. So cohesion is like attracted to like. Adhesion is going to be the attraction between different substances. So in this, in the instance of water, a good example here would be between water and the xylem of the plant. Remember, the xylem is the tubes that transport the water throughout the plant, and the water is actually attracted to the xylem. The xylem has a little bit of charge to it, and so the water and the xylem are attracted to one another due to adhesion, which again helps keep the water from falling back down due to gravity. Okay, so let's relate all this water information to plants. Right, so if I'm looking at this plant here, I can see where water enters the plant, right? Water is absorbed down at the plant by the roots, and the roots help that with various adaptations that they have to help encourage absorption. So the roots absorb the water, but the water leaves up here through the shoot system, up here through the leaves, and that's where the plant needs the most water, right? The water is going to help do photosynthesis, which occurs in the shoot system up there in the leaves. So that water has to get down from the bottom of the plant and the roots up to the top. And it's going to use these properties of water to help get there. Okay, so let's look at a couple adaptations that the roots have to help facilitate the absorption of water. First of all, a lot of them have what are called root hairs. Root hairs are going to increase the surface area. So the more surface area I have coming in contact with the soil, the more water that can be absorbed. So roots will have surface areas they'll have root hairs that'll increase their surface area. Okay. There's also its relationship with fungus, which is called mycorrhizae. This was talked about briefly in the last video. Okay, so mycorrhizae is a mutualistic relationship between fungi in plants. And so it basically, it acts like a root hair. It increases the surface area so the plant can absorb more minerals and more water. And remember, fungus is a heterotroph, so it needs a food supply from somewhere. So the plant provides some food to the fungus, and the fungus is help increasing the surface area of that plant to help it absorb more nutrients from the soil. Okay, so transpiration is going to be our driving factor that's going to help control water movement. Okay, so transpiration is basically the evaporation of water from the leaves of the plant. And if you remember, plants have those stoma or stomata on the bottom, those openings that are controlled by the guard cells. Okay, remember, the potassium goes in and out of the guard cell and the water follows it. The guard cell is open when it's turgid. Remember, the guard cell is, the stomata is open, the guard cell is swollen, and so it opens up that stomata. When it is less turgid, when the water leaves the guard cell, it shuts down and closes that stomata. Again, that's in the last video, so if you don't remember that, you may want to go back and take a look at that. So the opening and the closing of the stomata really have an impact on transpiration. Okay? They're going to regulate the amount of water that is let out. The opening and closing there regulates the amount of water that's let out. Okay? Our driving force behind most respiration is going to be the sun. Okay, because water is going to move from a high to a low concentration. Okay, and so if I have a lot of water down at the roots and very little water out in the air, okay, the water will actually evaporate out into the air, trying to equal that out. And in doing so, okay, and using those properties of cohesion and adhesion, it'll help pull the water up the tree. So let's apply some of these properties of water then. So if I have a lot of water down here at the bottom, because it came in down at the roots, and I need to get that water up the tree. I need to get it up to the leaves for photosynthesis, and it's naturally being pulled up out through those stomata. Well, those water molecules, remember, are cohesion and adhesion. So those water molecules are attracted to one another. So I basically get a chain of water molecules that are going to travel up the xylem. Remember, so that's my cohesion. And then remember my adhesion, they're also attracted to the sides of the wall of the xylem. So that's going to help keep them from rolling back down. They're not going to do that because they're going to be sticking to the walls of the xylem as well as one another. And so the sun is the main driving force behind this. Some other things that can influence transpiration would be humidity. Okay, if it's a really dry climate, transpiration happens faster. If it's a really moisture-rich climate, transpiration happens slower. Wind makes an impact on transpiration. An increase in wind, okay, is going to increase transpiration. Heat can also increase transpiration. Okay, so low humidity is an increase in transpiration. Again, heat can increase transpiration. The warmer temperatures can help increase transpiration. Okay, so you guys are going to see in class, you're going to do some lab, some demonstration stuff where you're going to be able to see and measure that water moving up through the leaves. That is so important to the plant so that it can get the water that it needs to be able to do photosynthesis.